51 years ago, on a humid August night in Waco, Texas, a 19-year-old girl named Anna Caldwell finished her shift at a small tailor shop and began the short drive home. She never arrived. By dawn, her pale yellow Chevrolet Nova was found parked crooked near the Bosque Bridge, its keys still in the ignition, her work bag on the seat, and an unopened can of Coca-Cola beside it. No struggle, no witnesses, only silence. Authorities ruled that she had left on her own. No foul play suspected. The file was closed. But her mother, Ruth Caldwell, never believed that story. For decades, she waited, certain that her daughter never left that river road. The yellow car gathered dust, the police reports faded, and the memory of the missing girl dissolved into Texas heat. Until now. Nearly half a century later, an investigator opens the forgotten box marked number 74 Caldwell. Inside are 6 blurry Polaroids, a white handkerchief embroidered with the letters AC, and a single strand of hair preserved in dried mud. What he finds hidden in one of those photos will change the story that Waco believed for 50 years. A discovery that exposes not just a killer, but the shadow of power that protected him. What was truly waiting by the Bosque Bridge that August night? And how did the most trusted man in town hide the truth for almost half a century? If you want to uncover the answers to these questions, like this video and subscribe to Unscripted Tales. Make sure to turn on the bell icon so you never miss our upcoming episodes. Tell us from which city you are watching this cold case story, and help us reach 5,000 likes to bring more lost voices back to light. Now let us begin. Waco, Texas, August 1974. The night air hung thick with heat and humidity. Winds from the Bosque River carried the scent of mud and wild grass. On a quiet street leading out of downtown, scattered yellow streetlights flickered over shuttered shops and faded signs. In one of those small buildings, Bright Stitch Tailor Shop, a young woman named Anna Caldwell folded her uniform with careful precision and placed it in a cloth bag. She thanked her manager, smiled softly, and stepped into the night. Her pale yellow Chevrolet Nova sat under a dim streetlight, paint glinting faintly under a haze of dust. She started the engine, the hum echoing down the empty street. A few blocks away, she stopped at a Gulf station, greeted the attendant, and bought a cold Coca-Cola. She mentioned that she was heading home for dinner with her mother. The man remembered her smile, simple, kind, and fleeting, before the taillights of her Nova disappeared down Highway 84. Hours later, the house on the edge of town remained lit. A single lamp on the kitchen table glowed over 2 untouched plates. The minute hand of the clock trembled near midnight. Ruth Caldwell sat by the window, eyes on the road, waiting for headlights that never appeared. Outside, cicadas hummed in the trees. Inside, silence grew heavier with each passing minute. When the sun rose over Waco, Anna's bed was still made, her shoes neatly placed under the dresser. Ruth's trembling hand reached for the phone. At 5:12 that morning, her voice broke through the line to the Bell County Sheriff's Office. "My daughter did not come home last night. I am afraid something has happened." That call marked the beginning of a search that would echo across 50 years. The heat of that August evening in Waco clung to the air like a blanket. The sun had already slipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky the color of rust and smoke. Cicadas screamed in the trees, and the air carried the faint smell of oil and wild grass from the Bosque River. Streetlights flickered weakly along the quiet road that cut through town, their yellow glow bending through waves of heat. Inside Bright Stitch Tailor Shop, the day was ending. The hum of sewing machines had gone silent. Anna Caldwell, 19 years old, stood behind the counter folding her uniform with the same care she gave to every stitch of fabric she touched. She tucked the uniform neatly into her cloth bag, thanked her manager, and stepped out into the humid night. Her shoes crunched softly on the gravel lot. Her pale yellow Chevrolet Nova sat beneath a dim streetlight, the kind of car that looked ordinary but carried her whole world. She started the engine, and the headlights painted two bright lines through the dark. The sound of the motor faded as she pulled onto the road that led toward Highway 84. She drove slow, perhaps tired, perhaps lost in thought about dinner with her mother waiting at home. At the Gulf station on the corner of Elm and 9th, a night worker leaned against the doorframe, wiping oil from his hands. He remembered the girl who stopped for a cold Coca-Cola, smiling faintly as she said she was heading home for dinner. He remembered the way she looked, her brown hair damp from the heat, her floral dress fluttering as she stepped back into her car. The bottle clinked against the seat beside her. He watched the taillights of the yellow Nova fade into the empty road, red dots swallowed by darkness. After that, no one saw Anna Caldwell again. Back at the small Caldwell home at the edge of town, the kitchen light burned steady. On the table, 2 plates sat untouched. The air inside was still except for the steady tick of a wall clock. The second hand crawled past 11, past midnight. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the sound of the river. Ruth Caldwell stood by the open door, her voice soft but breaking as she called into the night, calling a name that never came back. Hours passed. The coffee on the stove turned cold. The road outside stayed empty. By dawn, the horizon began to glow gray and pink over the fields. Anna's bed was untouched, the blanket smooth, her shoes still neatly placed under the dresser. The house was filled with silence heavy enough to hear her own heartbeat. At 5:12 in the morning, Ruth lifted the telephone receiver with shaking hands. The sheriff's night officer heard only a quivering breath before a voice came through, low and certain. "My daughter did not come home last night. I am afraid something has happened." That call began what would become one of the longest unanswered searches in Texas history. Somewhere between the quiet streets of Waco and the dark curve of the Bosque Bridge, the truth of that night was buried, and the river was already holding its secret. The call from Ruth Caldwell reached the Bell County Sheriff's Office just after sunrise. The dispatcher scribbled the words, "Missing person, 19-year-old female, last seen near Highway 84. Sheriff Wallace Ford was already in his office, coffee half finished, when the note landed on his desk. He paused, reading the trembling handwriting, and within minutes, his patrol car was heading toward the Caldwell home. The small white house stood silent, curtain half drawn, the front door open to the morning heat. Ruth met him at the doorway, her eyes red and sleepless, her voice breaking as she explained that Anna had never missed a night at home. Ford listened carefully, the sound of cicadas growing louder in the yard. He asked for a recent photograph. Ruth opened a drawer and handed him Anna's graduation picture, edges worn from years of touching. The young woman in the photo smiled softly, wearing the same necklace Ruth said she had on the night she disappeared. Ford tucked the photo carefully into his pocket and promised her he would find her daughter. By mid-morning, the sheriff's office was alive with motion. Radios crackled. Deputies pinned maps of Waco to the corkboard and marked circles in red ink along the route Anna might have taken. Firefighters joined the search along with volunteers from nearby towns. They combed fields, tree lines, and ditches under a rising wall of Texas heat. The air shimmered above the asphalt. Dust clung to every pair of boots. They began with the route between Bright Stitch Tailor Shop and the Caldwell home. They checked the Gulf gas station where Anna had stopped for her Coca-Cola. The night worker, Carl Benson, stood outside wiping sweat from his forehead as Ford approached him. The man described the girl clearly. Brown hair, floral dress, a kind smile. Then his face changed as he remembered something else. He said a tall man had been standing near Anna's car while she was inside the station. He wore a blue shirt with white paint on the collar, like he had been working. The man spoke to Anna through her open window, and she smiled, though briefly. Carl said he watched them walk together in the direction of the Bosque Bridge. Then the lights of her car disappeared beyond the trees. Ford wrote every word. His stomach tightened. The river again. Always the river. Throughout the afternoon, search teams moved toward the Bosque Bridge. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees. Dogs sniffed through dry brush. Handlers shouted across the water line, and the hum of motorboats echoed down the river. Ford's shirt clung to his back as he scanned the shoreline. Eyes narrowed against the sunlight. The air smelled of mud and algae. He could feel the weight of dread settling deeper with every passing hour. By evening, 2 farmers arrived at the search command post, their hats in their hands. They told Ford that sometime around midnight they had seen a yellow car parked awkwardly near the bridge, its headlights still burning. They thought maybe someone had car trouble, but when they slowed their truck, the car door closed suddenly. They did not see who was inside. Ford pressed for more detail, but the men only remembered the strange angle of the car, half off the road, and the way the lights flickered through the trees. The next morning, as the sun rose red and heavy over the Bosque River, Sheriff Ford stood on the bridge itself. The water below shimmered like glass, hiding whatever secrets it kept. He drew a long breath and ordered every available unit to expand the search along the banks. Something told him the yellow Chevrolet Nova was near that water, and when they finally found it, everything about the case would change forever. The second morning of the search began heavy and breathless. The sky over Waco burned pale orange, and a thin mist curled above the Bosque River. Deputies and firefighters moved slowly through the wet grass, their boots sinking in the soft mud. Birds stirred in the trees, and the sound of insects filled the air. Sheriff Wallace Ford stood near the bridge, his hand shading his eyes against the rising sun. Every instinct told him that somewhere close the yellow car was waiting to be found. At exactly 7:16 a.m., a young firefighter shouted from the tree line 200 yards downstream. His voice echoed across the water. Ford turned sharply, heart racing, and followed the sound through the brush. Beneath a cluster of tall oaks, something pale shimmered between branches. The closer he came, the clearer it became. A yellow Chevrolet Nova, half buried in mud, nose angled toward the riverbank. The driver's door slightly open as if someone had stepped out and never returned. Ford's stomach dropped. The car was Anna Caldwell's. The keys were still in the ignition. Her cloth work bag lay on the passenger seat beside her wallet, a few coins scattered near the gear shift, and a cold, unopened Coca-Cola bottle resting upright like it had been placed there carefully. The floor was covered in dried river mud. The air smelled of oil, heat, and something faintly metallic. Ford examined the driver's seat. It was pushed all the way back, farther than Anna could have reached the pedals. Someone taller had been there. He crouched beside the car, studying the mud. 2 sets of footprints led away from the driver's door. One small, light, most likely hers. The other, deeper, larger, clearly male. The tracks moved toward the trees, then vanished into the grass. Ford's breath slowed. He knew, without saying it aloud, that this was no case of a runaway. Something had happened here. Something that took a young woman off this road and into silence. He called for the Polaroid camera from the equipment truck. A deputy snapped picture after picture, the car, the door, the keys, the footprints. Each click of the shutter echoed against the water like a warning. Ford kept his eyes on the bridge above, thinking how close they had been the night before. How close and how blind. But as the word spread, everything began to unravel. Locals from nearby farms arrived to watch. Curious onlookers leaned against trees, pointing, whispering. Reporters and townspeople trampled the mud. The once clear footprints blurred into chaos under the weight of boots. Tire tracks from volunteer trucks cut through the scene. By the time the sheriff ordered the area closed, the clean evidence, the only untouched truth they had, was gone. Ford stood by the car, jaw tight, helpless as the damage spread. The one place that could have spoken clearly had already been silenced by human hands. He looked at the yellow Nova, sunlight glinting off its hood, and felt the weight of failure press down on his shoulders. The case had just changed from a search to something far darker. And somewhere beyond the trees, the person who had sat in that car after Anna was watching every move they made. By noon, the yellow Chevrolet Nova was lifted from the mud and hauled back to the county station on a flatbed truck. The summer sun beat down on the car's roof as it rolled through the narrow Waco streets, followed by quiet onlookers and whispers that carried all the way to the courthouse steps. Sheriff Wallace Ford drove behind it, his jaw set tight, knowing that whatever truth lived inside that car was slipping away with every mile. At the small sheriff's garage, Ford and 2 deputies began their examination with what little they had. There were no forensic specialists, no proper kits, only flashlights, gloves, and a box of paper envelopes. The air inside the garage smelled of gasoline and sweat. They opened the driver's door carefully. Mud flaked from the pedals. The floor mats were damp and streaked with red clay from the Bosque. On the outer edge of the driver's side, Ford noticed something that froze him. A single, deep boot print pressed into the dried mud beneath the frame. The heel was broad, heavier than any woman's step. He crouched lower, tracing it with his flashlight. Then his eyes moved to the back seat, where faint threads of torn fabric clung to the upholstery. Blue threads, possibly from a shirt. When Ford leaned forward toward the dashboard, he caught the glint of fine scratches across the glove compartment. They were shallow, uneven, as though someone's fingernails had scraped the surface in panic. He said nothing for a long moment, only stepped back, his breath slow and heavy. One deputy suggested taking mud samples from the tires and seat wells and sending them to the crime lab in Dallas. Ford agreed, but the office clerk reminded them that the department had already exceeded its monthly budget. The supplies they needed were not available. Every test they discussed ended with the same quiet answer. No funds, no time, no resources. The evidence they did collect? Mud, cloth threads, small debris from the car floor, was wrapped hastily in brown paper, sealed with tape and labeled in ink that began to smear in the Texas humidity. There were no proper evidence bags, no chain of custody. When Ford asked for storage space, he was told that the garage was already full. Pressure began to rise from above. The county wanted the story to fade before the local papers stirred panic. There was no body, no clear crime, and the simplest answer was the one they wanted to believe, that Anna Caldwell had left on her own. Within 4 days, Ford received a quiet order to release the vehicle to the family. Ruth Caldwell stood in her yard when the car was returned. The Nova looked smaller now, stripped of mystery, just a shell of metal and silence. She covered it with a blue tarp and tied the corners against the wind. It sat beneath the oak tree like a gravestone for the truth. The official report filed that week stated that no signs of foul play were found. Case 74. Caldwell was marked inactive and placed among 100 other forgotten files. That moment, the day the yellow Chevrolet Nova was handed back to the family, was the moment. The trail went cold, and somewhere in Waco, the man who had driven that car after Anna was still walking free, smiling behind a mask that no one dared to question. The yellow Chevrolet Nova sat silent under the blue tarp in Ruth Caldwell's yard, but Sheriff Wallace Ford could not let the silence settle. Something about the footprints, the torn threads, and the scratches on the dashboard haunted him. He believed someone had been with Anna that night, and now he needed to find who it was. Ford began his interviews with the people who had last seen her. He started with Carl Benson, the young worker from the Gulf Station. Carl repeated his story slowly, still uneasy about what he had seen. He told Ford again about the tall man in the blue shirt with white paint on the collar, the one who had stood near Anna's car. He said the man spoke to her through the window, and Anna smiled like she recognized him, maybe someone from church or town. Then they both walked toward the Bosque Bridge. After that, she was gone. Ford's next stop was Bright Stitch Tailor Shop. Anna's manager, Mrs. Harper, was an older woman who kept every detail in her head like thread lines on fabric. She told Ford that Anna had been cheerful that day, looking forward to dinner with her mother. She also mentioned that a man from Waco Baptist Church had stopped by the shop a few days earlier, asking for Anna by name. He said he wanted to thank her for helping with the church's clothing drive. Mrs. Harper remembered that his name was Pastor Raymond Hale. Ford paused at that name. He had heard it before. Everyone in Waco had. Pastor Hale was respected, loved, and trusted. His church was a centerpiece of the community. Later that afternoon, Ford met with Anna's ex-boyfriend, Mark Ridley. The young man looked shaken but calm. He explained that he had been out of town working at a ranch near Temple the night Anna disappeared, and his employer confirmed the alibi. That closed one path, but another was beginning to open. By the second day of interviews, Ford noticed that several townspeople spoke about Pastor Hale in the same careful way, softly, almost reverently. They said the pastor had always taken a special interest in Anna, praised her kindness, and called her a bright light for the congregation. He had even joined the search for her, bringing church volunteers to the bridge and praying with them at sunrise. During that search, he claimed to have found Anna's white handkerchief with her initials embroidered at one corner. That evening, Ford requested to speak with him. Pastor Raymond Hale arrived at the sheriff's office in a clean gray suit. His voice was gentle, his posture calm, his tone almost fatherly. He said that Anna had been like a daughter to him, a pure soul who never did wrong. He claimed he joined the search only to comfort Ruth Caldwell and the community. He said he had arrived late that morning, hours after the car was found, and that he simply wanted to help. Ford studied him quietly. The pastor's answers were smooth, polite, and perfectly rehearsed. His eyes, however, held something Ford could not name. After Hale left, Deputy Tommy Greer leaned closer to Ford and spoke in a low voice. He said there was something about that man's eyes, something that made his skin crawl. Greer had seen guilt before, and this did not look like innocence. Ford made a note of the pastor's name in his file, underlined twice. There was no proof yet, only unease, an unease that clung to him through the night like the heat from the Bosque River. And as the investigation slowed, that same calm and smiling man began to stand closer to the center of it all, hiding behind the very faith that protected him. The weeks that followed were slow, heavy, and filled with unanswered questions. Sheriff Wallace Ford kept his notes close, replaying every lead in his mind. But with no body, no witness beyond uncertain memories, and no clear evidence left untainted, the pressure from county officials began to rise. They wanted calm restored. The newspapers had stopped printing her name. And in a town that leaned on faith more than fact, few people wanted to believe that the man who led Sunday service could hide a darker truth. At the county courthouse, meetings were held behind closed doors. Ford sat through them, listening to phrases like limited budget and lack of evidence. Each one felt like another nail sealing the lid on the case. The leadership urged him to move on, to treat it as a disappearance, not a crime. The community needed peace, they said, and without a body there could be no crime to prove. After only a few weeks, Ford was ordered to close the file. The official 1974 report stated simply that no foul play was suspected and that 19-year-old Anna Caldwell was considered a voluntary missing person. Ford typed those words with his hands shaking. He knew it was wrong. He knew it was the quiet end of something that should never have been silenced. In the evidence room, the few collected items were gathered and sealed away. 6 Polaroid photographs, blurred and uneven, a white handkerchief embroidered with the letters AC, and a brief handwritten summary of the search, marked incomplete. These were placed in a small cardboard box. On the front, written in black ink, was the label Case Number 74 Caldwell. The box was carried down a narrow flight of stairs and placed among hundreds of others in the county storage basement where the air smelled of dust and damp paper. Up on the hill, in her small yard, Ruth Caldwell continued to keep her daughter's car covered beneath that same blue tarp. Every few days, she brushed away the leaves and checked that the wind had not lifted the corners. The yellow paint slowly faded under years of sun and rain until it turned pale as bone. She refused to sell it, refused to let go, even when neighbors whispered that she was holding on to ghosts. Years passed. Ruth finally moved away to live with her sister in Temple. The car was left behind, towed off and scrapped by a salvage company that never knew the story it carried. By 1985, Sheriff Ford had been transferred out of Bell County. He carried the weight of the Caldwell case until his last day in uniform. That same year, he died quietly in his sleep, never knowing how close he had been. Down in that dark basement, the box labeled 74. Caldwell sat untouched on a sagging wooden shelf. Dust settled on its lid. The ink on the label began to fade. The edges softened from the damp air. And for nearly half a century, no one opened it again. But time has a way of uncovering what people try to bury. And decades later, one investigator would open that forgotten box and find something inside that would shatter 50 years of silence. 48 years had passed since the yellow Chevrolet Nova was pulled from the mud. The old sheriff was gone. The witnesses were scattered, and the memory of Anna Caldwell had slipped quietly into Waco's forgotten history. But in March of 2022, inside a windowless office at the Texas Cold Case Review Unit, one man's curiosity would bring her name back to life. Investigator Aaron Mills sat at his desk surrounded by decades of dust-covered files. He was a quiet man, the kind who believed that every missing person deserved a final chapter. While searching through the county's archived case list, one label caught his eye. Case number 74, Caldwell. The short description beside it read, "Female, 19, presumed voluntary disappearance. No foul play suspected." Something about that sentence felt wrong. Mills requested the box to be brought up from storage. Hours later, an evidence clerk appeared pushing a metal cart, and on it sat a small cardboard box, corners softened, tape peeling, the label faint but still readable. He lifted the lid carefully. Inside, time itself seemed to hold its breath. There lay a folded white handkerchief embroidered with the letters AC, its fabric yellowed with age. Beneath it, 6 Polaroid photographs, grainy, washed by time, but still showing fragments of the old search scene near the Bosque Bridge. And at the very bottom, wrapped in old brown paper, a small envelope labeled hair sample from dried mud. Mills leaned back in his chair, staring at the contents. He knew immediately that what had once been silent could now speak again. Modern technology could do what 1974 could not. DNA could trace truth from even a single strand. He began to document every piece, photographing, logging, and carefully sealing them in new evidence sleeves. As he lifted one of the Polaroids, something faint caught his eye. A handwritten note on the back, nearly invisible beneath years of smudges. It read, found by volunteer pastor R.H. Mills, frowned. He turned to his computer and began to search church archives from that period. Within minutes, the name appeared, Reverend Raymond Hale of Waco Baptist Church. The same church Anna Caldwell had attended. The same man who had led community prayers for her safe return. He felt a chill crawl through him. The initials matched. The connection was real. He did not wait another hour. The handkerchief, the hair sample, and all 6 Polaroids were sealed and sent to the Texas State Forensic Lab in Austin for advanced DNA and trace analysis. He filled out the submission form by hand, pressing the pen firmly into the paper as if to make sure the case number would never fade again. When the box left his office, Aaron Mills stood in the doorway watching it disappear down the hall, knowing he had just reopened a story that the entire town had chosen to forget, and he had no idea that what waited inside that evidence would not only confirm a killer's name, but reveal how close that man had always been. Weeks passed after the evidence was sent to the Texas State Forensic Lab. Investigator Aaron Mills checked his email every morning, waiting for any sign that the forgotten fabric from 1974 could still speak. Then, one quiet afternoon, the notification arrived. Test results complete. He opened the report slowly, his pulse beginning to rise with each word. The analysis of the white handkerchief had revealed two distinct DNA sources. One was confirmed female, belonging to the presumed victim, Anna Caldwell. The other was male, unidentified at first. But then came the final line, written in bold. The male DNA matched a living man in Texas named Raymond Hale. Aaron Mills leaned back in his chair, staring at the report, his mind racing. The same man who had claimed to help the search. The same pastor who had said Anna was like a daughter to him. His DNA was on the handkerchief she carried the night she vanished. The probability of error was practically zero. The evidence was undeniable. Mills closed the file and sat in silence. The past 50 years suddenly felt closer than ever. The man who had preached about faith and forgiveness had touched the one object found near Anna's disappearance. And somehow, after all this time, he was still alive. He pulled up public records, typing the name slowly. Raymond Hale, now 81 years old, residing in Temple, Texas. Still a minister, still conducting small home services, still smiling in community newsletters as the image of gentle faith. To the world, he was an old man of God. To Mills, he was now the prime suspect in one of the oldest unsolved cases in Texas history. From that day forward, the investigation became personal. Mills began discreet surveillance. He drove past Hale's quiet suburban home, noting the same old silver sedan parked in the driveway. He observed him walking each morning with a cane, greeting neighbors with a soft nod. Every movement calm, every word measured. But there was something about the man's posture. Still controlled, still proud. One morning, as Hale stepped into the sunlight, Mills noticed something glinting on his wrist. A watch, not just any watch. A distinctive old silver watch. The same style that appeared faintly in the 1974 Polaroid photographs. The one taken beside Anna's abandoned car. The realization hit like thunder. The man who had once been trusted to pray over the missing was the same man who had stood over her car before the police ever arrived. The predator had never left. He had simply grown old beneath the safety of his own reputation. Mills knew the evidence was strong, but he needed more. Something that could place Hale not just near Anna, but at the scene before anyone else arrived. And hidden deep in one of those faded Polaroid photographs, the answer was waiting to be found. Aaron Mills sat in the dim light of his office, surrounded by scanned images from the old Polaroids. The prints were faded, washed with decades of dust and sunlight. But one photo stood out, the image showing the yellow Chevrolet Nova half sunk in mud, surrounded by scattered figures. Something about it had always felt wrong. He opened the high-resolution scan on his screen and began to enhance it frame by frame. As the image sharpened, the details began to emerge. The outlines of the car became clearer, the shadows deepened, and then, almost hidden near the front of the vehicle, a man appeared. He was standing close to the driver's door, his body slightly turned toward the camera. His shirt sleeves rolled neatly, his posture composed. And on his wrist, gleaming faintly in the sunlight, was a silver watch. Mills leaned closer, his pulse steady but heavy. He froze the image, zooming into the reflection on the car's window. There was no mistaking it. The man was Reverend Raymond Hale, the same face from the church newsletters, the same watch still resting on his wrist nearly 5 decades later. According to official reports from 1974, The first sheriff's unit arrived at the scene around 8:15 in the morning. Yet the light in the Polaroid told a different story. Mills began to measure the direction of the shadows falling across the bridge guardrail and the treetops behind the car. Using archived sunrise data and meteorological records from that exact date in August 1974, he discovered something crucial. The length of the shadows, the color of the sky, and the angle of the light placed that photo between 6:40 and 6:50 a.m., nearly an hour and a half before law enforcement even reached the bridge. That meant only one thing: Reverend Hale had been there first. He was not helping the search. He was already at the scene long before it became one. The man who claimed to have arrived later in the morning had stood by Anna's car while it was still fresh, before police, before cameras, before anyone else. Mills dug deeper. He accessed the Waco Tribune archives and requested the original newspaper negatives from 1974. Under magnification, he found the same figure again. Hale, standing near the yellow Nova, calm and composed, in a scene with no police tape, no crowd, no uniforms. It was proof that the pastor's version of events was a lie. Every piece of evidence now pointed to a single truth. Hale had not stumbled upon the scene. He had controlled it. He had been there early enough to touch, to move, and to take whatever he wanted before anyone else arrived. The lie that had lived for nearly half a century was finally unraveling. And the man who had buried the truth beneath his pulpit had left his shadow imprinted forever in a photograph. But for Aaron Mills, one haunting question remained unanswered. If Hale had been there before the police, what had he really done in that missing hour by the river? The Polaroid had already destroyed Reverend Hale's story. But Aaron Mills needed more than lies and shadows. He needed to rebuild the truth. Piece by piece, he began to reconstruct the final night of Anna Caldwell's life. Inside his office, the whiteboard stood covered in maps, timelines, and newspaper clippings yellowed by time. Red strings traced the roads between the Bright Stitch tailor shop, the Gulf Station, and the Bosque Bridge. Every minute of that evening mattered, and every movement had to be placed exactly where it belonged. Through archived church records and interviews with surviving members, Mills confirmed that Waco Baptist Church had hosted a choir practice on the evening of August 19, 1974. It had been led by none other than Pastor Raymond Hale. The rehearsal ended early that night, around 7:30 p.m., according to a member's handwritten journal entry. At 7:40 p.m., Anna Caldwell clocked out from Bright Stitch Tailor Shop. Smiling politely to her manager, she gathered her bag. 10 minutes later, at 7:52, she was seen at the Gulf gas station buying a cold Coca-Cola, the last verified sighting of her alive. The travel time between the church and the gas station was barely 10 minutes. That meant Hale had more than enough time to leave choir practice, drive along Highway 84, and intercept her as she made her short trip home. Mills looked again at Hale's original statement from 1974, where he had claimed he was already home in Temple that evening. But when Mills pulled archived ministry bulletins from the church, the truth surfaced in plain sight. Hale had officiated a local prayer session that same night, proving he had not left Waco until much later. His alibi had been false from the very beginning. Aaron stepped back from the whiteboard, marker still in hand. He wrote across the center of the timeline in red ink, 7:30 to 7:55 p.m. The missing window, just 25 minutes. That was all it took for a 19-year-old girl to vanish, for a trusted pastor to become a predator, and for half a century of silence to begin. The disappearance was not random. It was deliberate, planned, and carried out by someone who knew her path, her habits, and the perfect place where no one would hear her scream. Aaron Mills stared at the board in silence. The clock ticked softly behind him. In those 25 minutes lay the truth of what had happened at the Bosque Bridge, the truth that had been buried for almost 50 years. But to prove it beyond doubt, he needed to find what the river had kept hidden all this time. By late summer of 2022, the case that had slept for 48 years was alive again. The DNA results, the Polaroid evidence, and the proven timeline had built a picture too strong to ignore. Investigator Aaron Mills filed for a warrant to search the home of 81-year-old Reverend Raymond Hale in Temple, Texas. The judge reviewed the file in silence, the words on those yellowed pages speaking louder than time itself. The warrant was signed just after midnight. At dawn, Mills and a small team of officers arrived at the quiet neighborhood where Hale lived. The morning air was still heavy with dew. Birds called softly from the trees as the convoy of unmarked cars rolled to a stop. Mills stepped out, heart steady, eyes fixed on the pale house ahead. The curtains were already open. The old pastor stood at the doorway waiting for them, his expression calm, almost welcoming. He greeted them politely, his voice thin but smooth. He did not ask why they were there. He simply stepped aside and told them they were free to look. That calmness, that control, chilled everyone in the room. It was the same composure he had worn in 1974 when he stood by Anna's car pretending to pray. The team began the search. Upstairs was clean, ordinary, neat rows of books, framed verses, photographs from church gatherings. But when Mills followed a narrow set of wooden steps into the basement, the air changed. It was cooler still and faintly smelled of old earth and oil. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dust until it caught on something strange. Pinned on the far wall was a large, faded map of the Bosque River. Red X marks dotted the winding waterway, one near the bridge where Anna's car was found, and another deeper toward the confluence where the river turned wide and dark. On a nearby table sat a small metal box. Inside it, wrapped in aged paper, lay an 8mm film reel labeled in shaky handwriting. Search 1974. Next to it was a folded piece of cloth stained with a faint red-brown smear, the same color as the Bosque mud. Mills froze, his pulse tightening. He knew immediately what this meant. The team carried the reel upstairs. A projector was set up in the living room. The light flickered against the wall, and the film began to play. Grainy black and white images filled the room. The yellow Chevrolet Nova, its headlights dim, parked crooked near the bridge. The footage was filmed at night before police had ever arrived. The camera shook slightly, as though held by nervous hands. Then a voice broke through the static. Low, trembling, almost in prayer. God, please forgive me. Mills felt the breath leave his chest. The face came into view for only a moment, lit by the reflection of the car's chrome. It was Hale. Younger, strong, his silver watch flashing under the beam of the flashlight. He was not only there before law enforcement. He had filmed it. He had documented his own crime scene, preserving his secret as though even God needed proof of his sin. The film ended abruptly, the screen falling into white light. Silence filled the room. Hale sat across from them in his chair, his hands folded neatly, his eyes fixed on the wall. He said nothing. Aaron Mills stood motionless, realizing the truth that had been buried beneath sermons and smiles. The man they had trusted to pray for the lost had filmed the moment he created the loss himself. And somewhere along that river, marked with red X's, something else was still waiting to be found. By late summer of 2022, the story that had been buried for nearly half a century was about to wake. The DNA, the Polaroid, and the timeline had built a wall of evidence too solid to ignore. Investigator Aaron Mills stood before a judge, his file thick with truth that the system had once overlooked. Within minutes, the judge's pen hit the paper. The warrant to search the home of 81-year-old Reverend Raymond Hale was signed. At dawn, Mills and a small team of officers drove through the quiet streets of Temple, Texas. The morning fog clung to the ground as they parked outside a pale house with white shutters and a trimmed yard. The man they were there for was already waiting, Reverend Hale stood at the front door, dressed neatly in his pressed shirt, his posture calm. He smiled faintly and told them to come in. That calmness, that practiced peace, felt colder than fear itself. The house was spotless. Every book was lined up, every picture frame dusted. Yet, when they opened the basement door, the air changed. The steps creaked under their feet as the light from their flashlights cut through the dark. The basement smelled of earth and oil and something older, like time itself had been hiding there. Against the far wall hung a large map of the Bosque River. Red X marks dotted the paper, one at the bridge where Anna's car was found, and another deep along the bend where the water turned black. On a small table beneath it sat a metal tin. Inside was an 8mm film reel labeled in shaky handwriting, Search 1974. Next to it lay a folded piece of cloth, stiff with dried reddish mud that matched the Bosque soil. Mills stared at it for a long moment before calling for the projector. Upstairs, the lights dimmed and the old machine began to hum. The reel flickered to life, the image shaking, grainy but unmistakable. The yellow Chevrolet Nova stood in the dark, headlights dim, half buried in mud. The camera moved slowly around it, breathing heavy, uneven. Then a voice whispered through the static, soft, broken, almost pleading. God, please forgive me. The lens caught a reflection in the car's chrome bumper. For a brief second, the light revealed a face. It was Hale. Younger, stronger, his silver watch gleaming under the beam of the flashlight. The reel ended suddenly. The room fell silent except for the faint whir of the projector. Mills looked across the room. The old pastor sat quietly in his chair, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the blank white wall where his secret had just played out. He had not only been there before the police. He had filmed the scene himself. The man who once led prayers for the missing had recorded the proof of his own sin. And across that same map marked with red X's, one spot deeper along the river now called out for the truth to be unearthed. The discovery of the film reel changed everything. It was no longer a quiet state case about one missing girl. It had become proof of something far darker. The evidence was handed over to the Texas Bureau of Investigation, and within days the Federal Bureau of Investigation was called in. The file labeled Case 74. Caldwell was reopened under federal review, nearly half a century after it was first sealed. Inside a conference room at Quantico, the Behavioral Analysis Unit gathered around the photographs, maps, and transcripts that Aaron Mills had built piece by piece. The footage of the pastor standing over the yellow Chevrolet Nova played in silence on a screen. The agents watched carefully, noting his calm movements, his lack of panic, and his whisper, God, please forgive me. The lead profiler leaned forward and began to speak. Reverend Raymond Hale was not simply a man of faith. He was a spiritual predator. He had used his authority as a pastor to control the people who trusted him most. His power came from his image, gentle, moral, untouchable. He had built his life around purity, repentance, and obedience. But beneath that was obsession. The analysts broke down his behavior. The way he inserted himself into the search. The way he filmed the car as if performing a ritual. The way he used religious words not out of guilt, but out of ownership. They saw it clearly. His actions were not random. They were structured, controlled, almost ceremonial. When they searched through historical case records from the same region, a chilling pattern began to form. Between 1971 and 1978, 3 other young women connected to local churches near the Bosque area had gone missing under similar circumstances. Each was last seen leaving evening choir or youth meetings. Each was described as kind, trusting, and deeply involved in church work. None were ever found. The pattern was too precise to ignore. The FBI profilers concluded that Hale's obsession was not born from lust or chance. It was about power. The power to purify what he saw as unclean, to control what he believed was drifting from faith. In his mind, he was cleansing sin through his own twisted version of mercy. He did not see murder. He saw redemption. Aaron Mills listened in silence as the profiler read the final summary aloud. Subject demonstrates ritualized behavior consistent with moral domination and spiritual justification. High probability of multiple victims concealed in proximity to water near Bosque River area. The words hit like a hammer. Anna Caldwell was never his only victim. She was simply the one whose story survived long enough to be heard. And across that river map marked with red X's, one symbol near the deepest bend now stood out more than the rest. A place where the water still hid what the pastor had once called forgiven. By July of 2022, the evidence against Reverend Raymond Hale was no longer a matter of belief. It was proof written in DNA, film, and history. The federal report had concluded that Anna Caldwell's death was not a disappearance, but an abduction and homicide carried out under the guise of faith. The warrant for his arrest was signed before sunrise. That morning, Aaron Mills joined a joint task force from the Texas Rangers and local law enforcement. The plan was quiet, deliberate. Hale still preached at a small chapel on the edge of the temple every Sunday. It was a white wooden building with a cracked bell and a congregation of barely 20 people, mostly elderly churchgoers who still called him Pastor Ray. The service had just ended. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows as Hale stood. At the front, speaking softly to a few parishioners, his silver watch glinting beneath the pulpit light. When the side door opened and uniformed officers stepped inside, the room fell silent. Conversations froze. The sound of shoes on tile echoed like thunder in the small space. Mills walked in behind them, holding the warrant in his hand. For a moment, Hale's eyes met his. There was no panic, no confusion, no surprise. Only recognition. The old pastor straightened his robe, nodded once, and said in a calm voice that sent a chill through everyone in the room, "I knew this day would come. I only followed God's will." The officers approached slowly, reading him his rights. He did not resist. His hands trembled slightly as they cuffed him, yet his face remained peaceful, almost proud, as though he believed he had been chosen for some higher punishment. The parishioners watched in stunned silence. Some began to cry. Others bowed their heads in disbelief. Mills documented every moment. The slow walk down the church steps, the rustle of the robe against the wind, the glint of the silver watch as Hale lifted his bound hands once to adjust his glasses. It was the image of a man who had lived his entire life behind a mask of holiness, now stripped bare under the morning sun. When the patrol car door closed, Hale looked out through the glass one last time at the chapel. His lips moved slightly, whispering words only he could hear. To him, this was not guilt. It was prophecy fulfilled. As the car pulled away, Mills felt a strange silence settle over him. The arrest had ended decades of waiting, but it did not feel like victory. Because somewhere along the Bosque River, one last red X on that map still remained untouched. The one place that had never been searched. The arrest of Reverend Raymond Hale was the end of one chapter, but inside the interrogation room, Aaron Mills knew it was far from over. The old pastor sat at the table, hands folded neatly, cuffs still. Around his wrists, the same faint smile resting on his face. Hours passed in silence. He refused water, refused food, and refused to speak. He stared at the wall like he was waiting for something, or someone, to give him permission to begin. Mills kept his voice calm, measured. He asked the same question again and again. "Where is Anna Caldwell? Where did you take her?" For nearly 4 hours, there was nothing, only the ticking of the clock and the steady hum of the air vent. Then, without warning, Hale shifted slightly in his chair and looked up. His eyes were steady, his voice soft, almost like a sermon. He said, "Where the river splits in two, where God washes sins clean." The room fell silent. Mills leaned forward. He asked what that meant, but Hale would not repeat it. He only closed his eyes and whispered something that sounded like a prayer. Mills left the room, his mind racing. He wrote the phrase down on a notepad and underlined it twice, "Where the river splits in two." It sounded like scripture, but he knew it was something else, something geographical. Back at his office, Mills opened an old map of McLennan County. He traced the Bosque River with his finger, following every bend and turn. Then he saw it, the place where the North Bosque and South Bosque rivers merged west of Waco, a quiet area of dense trees and shallow water known locally as the Confluence Bend. The memory of the map in Hale's basement flashed in his mind. The second red X, the one deeper along the river that had never been searched. It was the same location. Mills realized what Hale had meant. That was where he had taken her. The place where he believed the river could wash away what he had done. He gathered his team, spreading out the maps across the table, marking coordinates and floodplain lines. The plan was set before midnight. At first light, they would begin the recovery operation. The river had held it secret for nearly 50 years, and by dawn, it would finally be forced to give it back. The morning came heavy and gray over Waco. Mist rose from the surface of the Bosque River as the convoy of law enforcement. Vehicles rolled toward the Confluence Bend. The air smelled of rain and mud, thick with the weight of what they were about to uncover. Reverend Raymond Hale sat in the back seat of a patrol car, his hands cuffed, his eyes calm and distant. He spoke softly to himself the entire drive, words that sounded more like prayer than remorse. When they arrived, officers stretched yellow tape around the clearing where the two branches of the bosque met. The water moved slow and silent, glinting faintly under the pale morning light. Aaron Mills stood near the riverbank, his jaw tight, his hands cold despite the heat. This was it, the place Hale had described, the second red X on the old map. Forensic teams moved in with quiet precision. Ground-penetrating radar swept across the soil near a cluster of willow trees, the same trees that had likely stood there in 1974. The monitor beeped sharply, marking an irregular shape roughly 3 feet below the surface. The technicians exchanged glances, then began to dig carefully, inch by inch. The earth gave way slowly, clumps of dark soil falling aside until the outline of a small pit began to take form. A moment later, one of the diggers froze. Something pale was showing through the dirt, a fragment of bone. Then another. The team fell silent. As they cleared more soil, a faded piece of cloth appeared. Thin, worn, almost melted into the mud. Next to it, a single women's shoe was pulled from the earth. The brand label, though faint, still read Bright Stitch, the same tailor shop where Anna Caldwell had worked her last shift. Mills swallowed hard. He knelt beside the site, his breath shaking as he watched the fragments of the past rise from the ground after 48 years of silence. He knew, without question, they had found her. Behind the tape, Reverend Hale watched the excavation unfold. He did not look away. When the shoe was lifted from the mud, he closed his eyes and whispered softly, "She is at peace now." Mills turned toward him, fury cutting through his composure. He stepped closer, his voice low and trembling with anger. "You buried her like she was nothing," he said. But Hale only smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the river. "I saved her soul," he murmured. "The water made her clean." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout could have been. The river moved on quietly, carrying sunlight across its surface, as if indifferent to the secret it had kept for half a century. Aaron Mills looked at the bones, the shoe, the fragments of cloth. All that remained of the girl whose story had begun as a headline and ended as a whisper in mud. He knew that justice was finally standing in the same place where faith had once been used as a weapon. And as the evidence was collected and sealed, the current of the Bosque seemed to whisper another truth, that this was not over yet, because Hale's map still had more red X's. The remains recovered from the Bosque confluence were sealed, labeled, and sent to the Texas State Forensic Lab under 24-hour guard. For Aaron Mills, that drive from the recovery site to Austin felt endless. The evidence in those containers was not just proof of a crime. It was the voice of a girl who had been silenced for nearly half a century, finally ready to speak. Inside the lab, forensic experts began the delicate work. Every bone fragment, every scrap of fabric, every trace of hair was cataloged with care. DNA extraction was performed from the femur and tooth samples recovered from the shallow grave. Days passed in tense silence until the results came through. The mitochondrial DNA matched perfectly to the sample taken from Ruth Caldwell decades earlier, before her death. It was confirmed beyond question. The remains belonged to 19-year-old Anna Caldwell, but the report did not stop there. Among the personal items found near the body, technicians discovered a small corroded piece of metal, part of a wristwatch band. When they examined it closely, they found 2 strands of hair caught between the links. Under magnification, the lab confirmed that one belonged to Anna Caldwell. The other matched the DNA of Reverend Raymond Hale. The connection was final and absolute. The man who had prayed over her disappearance had physically been with her when she died. Then came the most devastating finding of all. The skull showed signs of a severe fracture to the left temporal bone, evidence of blunt force trauma consistent with a strike from a heavy object. But what chilled the team even more was what they found in her airway. Traces of Bosque River mud and silt were lodged deep in her lungs. That meant she had still been breathing when she was buried. She had been alive when he placed her in the ground. When Aaron Mills read that section of the report, he set the paper down and stared at the wall for a long time. The shallow depth of the grave, barely 3 feet, meant that in 1974, when Sheriff Ford's team had searched the area, they had been less than 200 yards away. If the search perimeter had expanded just once more, Anna might have been found alive. The weight of that truth crushed him. For all the years that had passed, the greatest failure had not been the lack of technology. It had been the lack of belief. The system had chosen to trust a man in a collar over a mother in grief, and that decision had buried her daughter alive. When the official report was released, the classification of Case 74, Caldwell was changed from missing person to homicide by asphyxiation and blunt force trauma. Aaron Mills closed the file slowly, knowing that justice had come too late to save her life, but not too late to reveal the truth. And as he prepared to face Raymond Hale one final time, he knew the pastor still had something left to say. The courthouse in McLennan County had not seen a crowd like this in decades. Reporters filled the front benches, cameras lined the hallway, and townspeople who still remembered the summer of 1974 waited in silence for the doors to open. Inside, at the defense table, sat an 81-year-old man who had once been called Pastor Ray. Now he wore an orange jumpsuit, his silver hair combed neatly, his hands resting calmly on the table. Reverend Raymond Hale looked less like a monster and more like someone's grandfather. And that, Aaron Mills thought, was exactly what made him dangerous. The trial began with the quiet weight of history pressing on every word. The prosecution opened with the story that had waited 48 years to be told. They laid out the evidence piece by piece, turning what had once been whispers into facts that no one could ignore. First came the DNA on the handkerchief, 2 profiles, Anna Caldwell and Raymond Hale. Then the Polaroid photographs, enhanced and analyzed, proving that Hale had been at the yellow Chevrolet Nova long before police arrived. The jury saw the timestamps, the light angles, the calculations that left no room for coincidence. Then the lights dimmed as the projector played the 8mm film. The courtroom watched in silence as the grainy footage flickered across the screen. The yellow car in darkness, the shaky camera, and the unmistakable voice of Hale whispering, "God, please forgive me." That sound filled the room like a haunting echo, and several jurors looked away. Next came the basement map, dotted with red X's marking sites along the Bosque River. Then the watch band with 2 hairs twisted together, one from Anna, one from Hale. Finally, photographs of the shallow grave at the Bosque confluence were shown, the same riverbank where he had once claimed to cleanse her soul. The defense tried to push back. They argued contamination after so many decades. They claimed Hale was only trying to help investigators by leading them to the truth. They said his age made his memory unreliable, his confessions the product of a confused old man. But the prosecution answered with precision and fire. Hale had not helped, they said. He had controlled. He had staged the search to appear righteous while ensuring his secret remained buried. He had filmed the scene not out of remorse but ownership, an act of pride, not guilt. Then came the most powerful testimony of the trial. Retired Deputy Tommy Greer took the stand. His voice cracked as he recalled being a young deputy in 1974, told by superiors not to press too hard against a man of God. "They told me to leave the pastor alone," he said, "and because we did, that girl was never found." The courtroom fell silent except for the sound of his voice trembling through years of regret. When Hale himself was finally allowed to speak, he did not ask for forgiveness. He looked directly at the jury, his voice soft and unwavering. "I saved her soul," he said. "She was pure again when the river took her." The room erupted in gasps. Even his own defense attorney lowered his eyes. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The foreperson stood, her voice steady. "We find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder." In that single moment, 50 years of silence broke. The courtroom did not cheer. It did not clap. It simply breathed again. Justice had come late, but it had come. As Hale was led away, he turned once toward the window, the faint sunlight reflecting off the same silver watch he had worn since 1974. He smiled, as if still believing he had done the work of God. Aaron Mills watched him disappear down the hallway, knowing that monsters do not always hide in shadows. Sometimes they preach from the pulpit, and yet the story was not finished. Because when the authorities returned to that basement to catalog every item on the Bosque map, they found one last X, one that had never been searched. The courtroom was silent when the judge returned with the sentence. The gavel struck once, sharp against the wood, echoing through the room like the final heartbeat of a story that had waited almost half a century to end. Reverend Raymond Hale, once the respected pastor of Waco Baptist Church, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He stood as the words were read, his back straight, his hands clasped calmly in front of him. When asked if he wished to speak, he simply nodded and said softly that he had done only what God commanded, that he had given Anna Caldwell peace. Those words carried no guilt, no sorrow, only the hollow echo of a man who had built his own religion from his crimes. As he was led away, the chain around his wrists clinked faintly against his robe sleeve. For a moment, he looked toward the small crowd in the courtroom, but there was no forgiveness there. No prayers, no redemption. Only the cold truth that his faith had been nothing more than a weapon. Aaron Mills watched him go, the same way you watch a shadow fade when the light finally returns. He opened the file one last time and wrote the closing line with slow, steady handwriting. Homicide confirmed. Suspect convicted. Victim identified. The case that had been marked as missing since August 1974 was finally closed. But some stories never truly leave the air. They linger in the empty spaces left behind. After the trial, Mills drove out to the edge of the Bosque River. The same bend where the recovery had taken place was now quiet again. He stood beneath the trees, listening to the sound of the water and the wind moving through the reeds. Somewhere beneath that current the past had been waiting all along. He thought of Ruth Caldwell, the mother who had never stopped waiting, the woman who kept Anna's car under a tarp for years, who called out her daughter's name into the night until her voice gave out, who, as neighbors recalled, made 2 cups of coffee every morning, one for herself and one she left on the table across from her, hoping that maybe one day Anna would come home to drink it. Her daughter was finally home now, though not the way she had dreamed. Anna's story was more than a murder. It was a lesson carved into the history of a town that once chose silence over truth. It was about how unchecked power can disguise itself as purity, how blind trust can let evil stand at the altar, and how, even when the system forgets, persistence can still dig truth out of the ground, no matter how many years it has slept beneath the soil. Because science does not forget, and neither do those who refuse to stop asking questions. Aaron Mills closed the file, placed it on the shelf, and turned off the light in his office. The story of Anna Caldwell was over, but her voice, uncovered after 48 years of silence, would never fade again. If you are still watching this story, it means this case has reached your heart. So this story deserves your like and your subscribe. Turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next untold truth on Unscripted Tales. And please, complete 5,000 likes on this story, because that is the target my mother set for you. Help me reach it. It is totally free. Tell me, from which city are you watching this cold case story tonight?